Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 14, Social Psychology. And today we're going to talk about obedience and a guy named Stanley Milgram. So, here we go. Certain individuals can command obedience of groups, even large masses. In your history books, you might hear a little bit about Hitler and the way he was able to control many of the Germans during the time leading to the Second World War, or even Benito Mussolini. Modern social psychologist or psychology has its origins in wartime crucibles of fear and prejudice. Hence, that's why we're kind of talking a little bit about guys like Hitler and Mussolini. Early social psychologists focused on personalities of people drawn into fascist groups. Specifically, they looked for an authoritarian personality behind the fascist group mentality. But as time has gone on, we've had other individuals who have demanded obedience, and they were not necessarily fascist. And so we're going to talk about a few of these. In 1979 or 78, there was a guy named Jim Jones. Now, granted, he was doing some of his work well before 1978. Matter of fact, he did a lot of work in the 1950s and 60s. He was a very charismatic religious leader. Started out, I believe, in Indianapolis and eventually moved towards the Bay Area around San Francisco. And he founded a group known as the People's Temple. He was getting a little bit of pressure from authorities in California, and eventually he moved his group to South Africa, to the country of Guyana. And that's where things kind of take a turn for the worst. They're following orders of their charismatic leader, the Reverend Jim Jones. Roughly 900 members of the People's Temple willingly administered lethal doses of cyanide to hundreds of their children, then to the parents of these children, and then eventually to the leaders themselves in what was like a mass suicide. Part of that was because governmental authorities had gone down to investigate, and they had obviously witnessed things that were meriting maybe extraditing Jim Jones back to the United States. Opposed to going back, this was the route that they chose. And a lot of people wondered, why would anybody so willingly follow this man into death? In 1993, there was a guy named David Koresh. Koresh was the leader of a group known as the Branch Davidians, and they were kind of stationed out of Waco, Texas. In the winter, or I guess you could say February or so of 1993, the government, for the most part the FBI, sent federal agents into the Branch Davidian compound. And what happens is we have a standoff that is going to last many, many, many days, weeks, months. And towards April of 1993, that's when things kind of take a turn for the worse. The Branch Davidians, sensing that the federal government was going to raid the compound by force, set fire to their quarters rather than to surrender. And then kind of the aspect of all things, again, there were many people who died, including Koresh himself. And people still, again, wonder why people would follow a leader like this. 1997, we had a group known as Heaven's Gate. These were what I would call kind of a tech cult. They were college-bred members. They followed their leader. And what they were basically doing is they were watching for the Heaven's Gate comet that supposedly was passing by Earth at that time. And when the comet was passing by, they decided to commit a mass suicide with the hope of achieving the higher plane of being. In other words, going, I guess, to what they would call their heaven. 2001, we had followers of Osama bin Laden, who eventually flew jets into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. So why would people follow these individuals? We have suicide bombers today that are both men and women that are willing to blow themselves up as revolutionary martyrs in places like Palestine. Maybe even when we talk about members of ISIS doing the same thing. Stanley Milgram, who is kind of a well-known psychologist who we're going to talk quite a bit about here, showed that the willingness of a people to follow the authority or the orders of an authority, even potentially lethal ones, is not confined to a few extreme personalities or deranged individuals. This finding, along with certain ethical issues that the experiment arises, places Milgram's work at the center of the biggest controversy in psychology. So let's talk a little bit about this guy, Stanley Milgram. He first conducted his experiment at Yale University on students and volunteers in that vicinity. Volunteers thought that they were participating in a scientific study of memory and learning. They were led to believe that the research was aimed to help improve learning and memory by punishing errors and rewarding correct responses. In the cast, we had some different roles. We had a teacher who was technically a volunteer subject, who was instructed to punish the memory errors made by another person. And just so we understand this, the role of the teacher is actually the only subject that's in this study. The rest of the participants, even though they may have specific roles, were kind of in on what Milgram was doing. So the role of the learner, for the most part, was the individual who would be the one committing these memory errors, and the one that would probably either be rewarded or punished depending upon the type of question. So, to administer the punishment, the teacher was told to throw a switch that would deliver electrical shocks to the learner each time that the learner made an error. The teacher was also told to increase the level of the shock by a fixed amount for every new error. A white-coated experimenter, who was in on this, was the experimenter, or I should say the authoritarian figure. We probably should change that. Who presented the rules and arranged for the assignments of roles and administered the teachers to do their job whenever they hesitated or dissented. The dependent variable was the teacher's response, measured by the highest shock level that he would be willing to deliver. Milgram gave each teacher a mild sample of the shock to convince them that the device worked and that they would be causing the learner increasing pain and suffering for each time that they switched or flipped the switch. Initially, there were no shocks that were administered during the actual experiment. The part of the learner was played by a mild-mannered man, roughly about 50 years old, who mentioned that he had a heart condition, though that might not have been. The task was to memorize pairs of words and then to choose the correct response for each stimulus word of a multiple choice listing. 75 volts, the script called for the learner to moan and grunt. When the level increased to 150 volts, the learner, for the most part, demanded that they would be released from the experiment. At 180 volts, he would cry out that he could no longer stand the pain any longer. The learner's protest increased with the increasing levels of shocks. For any teachers delivering punishment at 300 volts, the learner would shout out that he no longer could take part in the experiment and must be freed. If the teacher, that's our individual who's our subject, hesitated or protested about the delivering of the required shock at any level, the experimenter interrupted, stating that the experiment must continue, demanding that the teacher please continue. When the shock level rose to 375 volts, the learner screamed out, and then there would be a loud thud and then eventually silence. Virtually all the participants, your teachers that is, stopped shocking, but continued when the authority reminded them that failure to respond was an error that had to be punished. The experiment ended only when the shock level reached the 450 volt maximum, or when the teacher refused to obey. So the results. In Milgram's experiment, nearly 2/3 delivered the maximum 450 volts to the learner. Those who refused to give the maximum shock obeyed until they reached at least 300 volts. The results were the same among Yale College students as they were when this was tested among the general public. So, why do we obey authority? People tend to be obedient under the following circumstances. When a peer modeled obedience by complying to the authority figure's commands, when the victim was remote from the teacher or could not be seen or heard, when the teacher was under direct surveillance of the authority figure so that they were aware of the authority figure's presence, when a participant acted as an intermediary bystander, merely assisting the one who was delivering the shock rather than actually throwing the switches, when the authority figure had a higher relative status, as when the participant was a student and the experimenter was kind of billed as a professor or a doctor or some kind of professional. You can see that the obedience results from situational variables and not necessarily personality variables. Obedience research challenges the myth that evil lurks in the minds of evil people and that the bad, they differ from the good, that would be us, who would never do such a thing. Social models can have an enormous impact on how to behave, and that you should be aware that you are a social model for others. Thank you very much.